He said he would pay back 4 times. The law only required 2. Under Roman law, there were 2 categories of theft. Caught in the act, fourfold. Not caught, double. 2 times was for a man who could still argue. 4 times was for a man who couldn't. Zacchaeus chose 4. That wasn't generosity, that was a confession. But to understand that, you have to go back to Jericho. A spring morning, around AD 30, the main road through the city is packed, shoulder to shoulder, because word has spread that Jesus of Nazareth is passing through. Zacchaeus hears that name and stops. He looks around. Nobody moves, not because he's short, because they know exactly who he is. He's the Architalones, the chief tax collector. That word appears exactly once in the entire New Testament, and it's here, attached to his name. Not a regular tax collector. The man at the top of the network, with collectors working under him and a percentage coming up from all of them. He was wealthy the way you get wealthy at the top of a system built for extraction. And he's standing in the middle of the people he took from, trying to see through the crowd, and nobody gives him an inch. Now, Jericho wasn't just any city. In the first century, it was arguably the wealthiest in the region, and not by accident. The balsam tree grew only here, and in a small patch near Engedi. Nowhere else in the world. The Romans prized balsam resin above almost everything, for medicine, for perfume, for embalming. Josephus described it as the most precious thing Jericho produced. Entire caravans moved through here carrying goods from the Nabatean east toward the Mediterranean coast. Every one of them stopped at the gate and paid. Herod the Great built 3 of his palaces here. Jerusalem's aristocracy came to Jericho in winter to escape the cold. This was the city Zacchaeus ran taxes for. And as chief collector, he didn't just take a salary. He had purchased the franchise, paid Rome up front for the right to collect in this region, then recouped it from the population. Whatever he extracted above what Rome required was his to keep. The system didn't just allow that, the system was built on it. His name was Zacchaeus, from the Hebrew Zacchae. It means pure, innocent, clean. Every person in that crowd had been calling him that name his entire life. They all knew what it meant. None of them thought it fit. He looks up. There's a sycamore tree by the road, the kind planted along roadsides, the kind the prophet Amos described when he talked about the work of the poor. Low branches, wide canopy. He puts his hand on the lowest branch, and the richest man in Jericho climbs up. In a world where honor was everything, where a man of standing didn't run through the streets, didn't climb trees in public, what he did cost something real, something money couldn't buy back, but he climbed. The crowd below watches him settle onto a branch above their heads. And then Jesus stops. Jesus stops directly beneath the tree. Not because the crowd stopped, not because anyone pointed him there. He looks up and calls Zacchaeus by name. Come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Not an invitation. He invited himself. In a world where honor operated like currency, where who came to your home said everything about who you were in the community, that was the greatest public gift anyone could give. And Jesus gave it openly, in front of every person who had turned their back on Zacchaeus. But to understand why that landed so heavily, you need to understand where Zacchaeus actually stood in this world. The Roman tax system didn't work the way we imagine. There were no government employees going door to door. Instead, Rome sold the right to collect, auctioned off by region. The winner paid Rome up front in cash, then recovered it from the population however they could. Anything collected above what Rome required was theirs to keep. No ceiling, no oversight. That's why the position didn't produce tax collectors. It produced licensed extortionists. Zacchaeus was the Architalones. He didn't just hold one franchise, he ran a network. Other collectors worked under him, each with their own territory, each under pressure to deliver their quota to him, and he delivered his to Rome. In a city with Jericho's commercial traffic, balsam, dates, goods from the Nabatean trade routes pouring through daily, that network generated serious money. And he knew exactly where every coin came from. According to the Mishnah, tax collectors, mokhes, were classified alongside robbers, not as a figure of speech, as a legal category. They couldn't testify in court. They couldn't exchange money at the temple. In the eyes of the Jewish community, a man who entered this profession had effectively cut himself off from his people. Not simply because he worked for Rome, because of how he worked for Rome. His family knew this. His neighbors knew. All of Jericho knew. And his name, Zacchaeus, meaning pure, followed him everywhere. A quiet reminder of the distance between the man he was and the man he was supposed to become. There's one more thing worth knowing about that morning. Jesus wasn't passing through Jericho on a casual journey. He was on his way to Jerusalem for Passover, his final Passover. The crucifixion was days away. His disciples knew something was coming. The crowds following him knew something was coming. Jericho was one of his last stops before the city that would kill him. He chose to spend that night with Zacchaeus. Inside the house, the noise from the street fades. There's a meal, there's a table, and at some point during the evening, Luke doesn't tell us exactly when, doesn't give us the conversation that led to it. Zacchaeus stands up. He doesn't ask permission. He doesn't whisper it. He makes a public declaration in front of Jesus and everyone else in the room. Look, Lord, half of my possessions I give to the poor. Then he pauses. And if I have cheated anyone, I will repay it fourfold. Because that number, 4, meant something very specific, and Zacchaeus knew it. Look carefully at the words he uses. Half of my possessions I give to the poor, not a tenth, the standard Mosaic law required. Not a fifth, what a devout man might offer to show generosity. Half, everything he had accumulated at the top of that network, split down the middle and placed on the table. Think about what that actually means for a man in his position. The chief tax collector of Jericho, a city built on balsam monopoly and trade revenue, had been running this franchise for years. He had subcontractors. He had territory. He had the kind of wealth that came from sitting at the top of a system where money moved upward automatically. Half of that, gone, distributed to people who in many cases were the same people his network had overcharged. He wasn't rounding up, he was emptying out. But that wasn't the hardest thing he said. And if I have cheated anyone, the word if makes it sound like he's leaving the question open, like he isn't sure whether he's done it. But nobody in that room heard it that way. Everyone in Jericho knew what he did. He knew they knew. This wasn't uncertainty. It was the way a man with any remaining dignity begins a confession, without saying I stole from you directly, while making sure everyone understands exactly what he means. The room is quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is about to be said that can't be unsaid. He doesn't look away. I will repay it fourfold. The Greek word Luke uses here, apodidomi, isn't future tense in the way we use it. It's a present tense declaration. Not someday I'll do this. The commitment is happening now, in this room, as the words leave his mouth. He isn't asking permission. He isn't consulting anyone. He's announcing. And the announcement is already binding. There are people in that room he collected from, possibly standing right in front of him. People whose names he knows, whose professions he knows, whose exact overpayment he could calculate in his head. He looks at them and says 4 times. Not 2, not 3, 4. Now, the Jewish law on restitution was specific. Under Mosaic law, if you overcharge someone, the required repayment was the amount taken plus 20%. That was it. Double restitution applied when stolen property had already been destroyed or sold, when recovery was impossible. Fourfold was reserved for one particular case in Exodus, a man who stole a sheep, slaughtered it, and sold it. Deliberate, destructive. No going back. Zacchaeus wasn't quoting the minimum. He wasn't even quoting the standard for serious theft. He was reaching for the highest number in the entire Mosaic restitution code, a number associated with the most deliberate, most damaging category of wrongdoing. Most people hear fourfold and think, generous, more than required, a sinner trying to make things right. But that's not what the people in that room heard. They heard the number, and they knew what that number meant. Zacchaeus chose 4. In that room, in front of Jesus, in front of the people he had taken from, he didn't negotiate the number. He didn't offer 2 and wait to see if that was enough. He went straight to the highest, and everyone in that room understood what that meant. In a culture built on honor, public confession wasn't a neutral act. It was the end of a particular kind of life. Whatever social standing Zacchaeus still had, the house, the wealth, the visible success that came from running the most lucrative tax franchise in the region, he was trading it in, publicly, irrevocably, in front of witnesses who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. You didn't do that unless you meant it completely. There was no walking it back, no claiming you'd been misunderstood. The moment the words left his mouth, the confession was permanent. And he knew that when he said it. That's the part that changes the story. Not the number itself. You already know what the number meant. But the fact that he chose it voluntarily. In this room, in this city, in front of these people. He wasn't trying to appear generous. He wasn't calculating the minimum required to restore his reputation. He was done pretending the gap didn't exist. He wasn't becoming better. He was admitting how bad it had been. Those are two entirely different things. A man becoming better chooses a number that reflects his change. A man confessing chooses a number that reflects the truth, even when that number costs more, weighs more, confirms everything the crowd outside was already murmuring. And then consider the sequence, because this is the part most people read straight past. Jesus didn't say, "Today salvation has come to this house," after Zacchaeus made his declaration. Before, he walked to that tree, called the name, invited himself to dinner, and somewhere in that evening, before the promises, before the numbers, he looked at Zacchaeus and declared him restored. The confession came after the welcome, not the other way around, which means Zacchaeus didn't confess to earn something. He confessed because something had already been given. The 4 times wasn't the price of his redemption. It was the response of a man who had finally been seen clearly and chose to see himself the same way. His name was Zacchaeus, pure, innocent, clean. He had carried that name for decades like a debt he couldn't pay. And on the day a teacher from Galilee stopped under a sycamore tree and called him down, for the first time in front of the city that had written him off, he started becoming what the name had always said he was. The next morning, Zacchaeus walks out of his house. The same road he had always walked. The same faces that never moved aside. The same city that had known his name for years and knew exactly what it meant. But this time he walks out carrying something different. This story was never about a short man and a tree. It was never about doing more than the law required to prove a change of heart. It was about the cost of being truly seen. And what happens when a person finally looks at himself with the same clarity? Zacchaeus already knew who he was. The city knew too. What he wasn't sure of, until that day, was whether that was how his story had to end. Jesus stopped under that tree and showed him it didn't. Not after he changed, not after he promised. Before any of that, while he was still sitting on a branch in front of a crowd looking up at him, before a single word had been spoken, that was when Jesus called his name. Zacchaeus, pure. There's a question I keep coming back to every time I read this story. If Zacchaeus had to pay back every person he had wronged, how long was that list? And who do you think was first on it? He walked out the door that morning, and he went to find the first name.